Well, good morning, and thank you, Helen, for your kind invitation. It's a great privilege to be with you this morning and sharing something that's close to my heart. When my son Rob heard that I'd been asked to give a sermon about climate change, his question was, which aspect of climate change? In other words, climate change is such a vast issue that a 10-minute sermon hardly begins to scratch the surface. So I hope you'll permit me to go on a little bit longer, and I've noticed that the average of the previous sermons in this series works out at 20 minutes. So I'm hoping to finish before that. Don't worry. In recent months, this Swedish teenager has become a superstar. Greta Thurnberg warned the Davos summit that our house is on fire. She rightly pointed out that burning fossil fuels and consuming the Earth's resources is killing off plant, animal and insect species at over 10 times the expected rate. And I'm sure that Kate Williams, who you had previously, will have covered this in a recent talk. Greta has also warned that man-made global warming could melt the Greenland ice shelf, which would be bad news for half the global population, which now lives at sea level. Greta says she wants everyone to panic, but in my experience, panicking could easily make matters even worse. And in typical teenage style, Greta also claims that no one else really cares, which is, of course, nonsense. Christmas Eve 1968 was the moment when millions of people became committed to caring for creation. The Apollo astronauts took this picture known as Earthrise, showing our beautiful yet vulnerable planet. Suddenly, millions of people recognized that the Earth is a wonderful and unique planet which is teeming with life and diversity. How fortunate we are that the Earth's orbit is exactly the right distance away from the Sun, and the Moon is exactly the right size and position to produce daily tides. When set against the infinity of time and space, surely our lives are merely here today and gone tomorrow. And this picture of Earthrise also raises the disturbing question of what sort of world our grandchildren will be inheriting. Well, to tackle this vast subject, I'd like to start by looking briefly at what the Bible has to say, then reviewing church tradition, before attempting to summarise climate science. And finally, I'll be recommending some practical actions that Highman Benefice might like to consider. So what does the Bible say? Well, about 1400 years before the birth of Christ, when the first book of the Bible, Genesis, was being written, the people who lived in the ancient Near East came to the reasonable conclusion that the earth was encircled by a sea, and recognised the sun by day and the stars by night. These ancient people imagined a solid dome structure known as the firmament, which held up a body of water over the earth. God created all this in an orderly and amazing way that was beyond their comprehension and ours. Psalm 19 put it like this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the work of his hands." And this is an aspect of climate change that we perhaps overlook by being so concerned with the scientific dimension. Earlier we had a reading from Genesis, and I'd like to focus on verse 28, which is about subduing and having dominion. Back then, the forces of nature were so great that human life was fragile. And I expect we'd all agree that our ancestors got a bit carried away with subduing and having dominion over the planet. Since 1945, we've all been in a different situation where, in a sense, we have dominion over the planet. The shadow of the mushroom cloud still hangs over us. Moreover, we have overexploited the Earth's resources by deforestation, mining, and today's consumer society. If we take the United States, for example, which has 4% of the global population, but consumes nearly 20% of global energy. Talking of the world, John's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 16, has this to say: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life." And John here assumes we know the context of human disobedience as depicted in the story of Adam and Eve. But God had compassion by sending his precious Son on a rescue mission. And as evangelicals, some of us have a bit of a blind spot here. We read this verse as though God so loved people that he gave his only Son, when in fact what it says is God so loved the world, which surely is another injunction for people like us to also love what God has made, and by the grace of God to care for it more than we have been doing. Earlier we heard from John's Gospel in chapter 10, verse 10, which is another one of those wonderful promises that Jesus makes. It's also the basis of the diocesan vision statement. And surely everyone wants abundance, but the danger is that this plays into our consumer society's mindset for more and more material possessions. And I think the Diocese of Gloucester would do better, if I dare say this, by quoting the whole of the verse to recognise that we are up against an enemy who's working through human greed and capitalism to destroy our lives and the planet. The Church's year, when we come to look at tradition, gives us a lot of opportunities for celebrating God's creation, what with Plough Sunday, Rogation Days, Lammas-tide, harvest festivals. Plenty to go out there. And the Church of England lectionary has some great readings about the natural world that can inspire us during ordinary time, which, by coincidence, is marked by green vestments and altar frontals, as we've seen from Jeff Stoll today. About 10 years ago, the newspapers were full of scare stories about the global environmental crisis, and in response, the Orthodox Church introduced a new festival known as the Season of Creation. It actually runs from the 1st of September until the 4th of October. And in recent years, the Church of England has joined in. It's an opportunity for teaching about Christian discipleship leading up to the harvest festivals. The Season of Creation reaches its climax on St. Francis Day, which is the 4th of October. And St. Francis was popular even before Maggie Thatcher quoted from him in 1979 when going into number 10 Downing Street. Around the same time, the film Brother, Sun and Sister Moon was released, which our benefice over in the Cotswolds is hoping to show again at an evening discussion group. So I've hopefully covered a little bit about the Bible, a little bit about church tradition, and now I want to go on to the really difficult area of science. In the 17th century, Archbishop Usher of Northern Ireland worked out using the Bible alone that the first day of creation happened on a particular date. Sunday, the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. Which must admit, was quite an achievement, wasn't it? However, scientists in the 21st century have estimated that the Earth was formed a lot earlier than that. 4.5 billion years ago, to be precise. And if we could express this as a single 24-hour period, then at 3:30 a.m. life would have appeared on the Earth. By 11:40 p.m. the dinosaurs would have become extinct. At 1 minute to midnight, Charles Darwin would be pleased to realise that there'd been a divergence between chimpanzees and humans. And finally, at 3 seconds to midnight, we modern humans would have appeared. So that gives us some kind of context for the concerns we have at the present time. Weather conditions can vary a lot, even over a 30-year period, whereas climate change normally happens over much longer periods of time. It's true to say that scientists still only have a partial understanding of all the factors that influence our climate. For example, cycles in how much energy the sun is emitting, variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun, the tilt of the Earth, which makes for different seasons, oscillations and wobbles of the Earth's magnetic fields. The history of the climate can, though, be read in the rock structures. And in the past, volcanic activity and asteroids have shrouded the Earth in a dust cloud that has cut off sunlight, stopping plants from growing and killing off millions of animals, insects and fish. Traces of volcanic ash have been found as a distinct layer in the rocks of every continent. And since 1945, as I said earlier, we too have been capable of producing ash clouds using nuclear weapons. And a nuclear winter, even from the discharge of our own Trident submarines, would probably last about 100 years before the ash settled. And that would be another mass extinction. So I've tried to summarise these previous mass extinctions in a handout, which you should all have got a copy of. Please don't read it now, but enjoy it when you get home. That's if you could enjoy the prospect of extinctions, which gives us pause for thought for what God was doing in allowing these things to happen. But I think if we ponder that carefully, we will get to a good conclusion. And on the other side of the handout, there's a summary of how volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, warfare and plagues since the last ice age have caused Britain's civilizations to collapse several times. I found that extremely interesting as well. When in August 1945 the United States dropped the bombs on the two Japanese cities to end the Second World War, we went straight into the Cold War, and many atom bomb tests were conducted that left radiation in the rocks, which will last for thousands of years. And that's probably the only thing that future civilizations may remember about our generation. Bishop John Holtham, the C of E's bishop responsible for the environment, has said this: "The burning of fossil fuels, which have been in the earth for 1 billion years, is the energy equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshimas every day." Now, if this statement wasn't coming from somebody like John Holtham, I would question it. But can you imagine 400,000 Hiroshimas every day? That's the amount of energy we're using at the moment. The so-called hockey stick graph, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of or examined for yourselves, was published in 1998 and has provoked a lot of arguments for and against. It shows that in the past 150 years, since the Industrial Revolution got started, global temperatures have risen steeply and supposedly in line with increased carbon dioxide from all the burning of fossil fuels. Climate scientists have reconstructed the average temperature of the Earth since the Industrial Revolution and found an increase of 1 degree Celsius, which doesn't sound a lot, but in the space of 150 years is a lot. And this diagram tries to explain how it happens. The sun's energy passes through the Earth's atmosphere, but combustion gases such as carbon dioxide are preventing some of the sun's energy being reflected back out into space. Instead, it's being absorbed pretty much in the oceans. And all this is known as the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide and other gases have been steadily building up for the last 150 years, and because of the population explosion, they look set to continue until the end of this century. By then, the average surface temperature is expected to have increased by at least 2 degrees Celsius. And as you probably know, climate scientists and governments are striving to keep it at less than 1.5%. However, these predictions are being challenged by a minority of scientists, and perhaps some of you in the pews this morning. Interestingly, some of those who are opposing these efforts are them being sponsored by mining corporations. Well, that brings us to this final question. To what extent do all these three insights that I've shared, the Bible, church tradition and science, to what extent do they line up and help us to discern how God would have us respond? Well, I think the Bible makes it very clear that our first duty is to worship God. And God has revealed to us in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. So that's our first duty. And worship is the place where we receive inspiration for loving service and for better stewardship of creation. And I do hope that Highman Benefice will be celebrating the season of creation starting on the 1st of September, at least in some way or another. One thing I've noticed recently is a growing number of angry Christians, as though they're idolising the environment, perhaps in the same way, dare I say, that the Quakers are known mostly for campaigning against nuclear weapons. And I say that as a member of Christian CND. But I would urge caution about this, because, as I said a moment ago, I believe we need to keep worship at the centre of our lives and show a distinctively Christian way of being stewards of creation. Dr. Gail Bradbrook from Stroud is a founder member of an organisation I'm sure you've heard of, Extinction Rebellion. This is the group that recently organised sit-down protests on several bridges across the Thames in London. Some of them believe that climate change is just a symptom of a toxic Euro-American culture which taught that indigenous people were animals, not humans, and therefore God had given us dominion over them. And you can see where that's coming from. Extinction Rebellion claims that European civilization was spread around the globe using cruelty and violence, especially over the last 600 years. Well, I don't know what you think of their analysis of recent history, but I have a few problems with it, although I certainly respect Kate Williams and others who have joined Extinction Rebellion. If we're to take seriously, though, the warnings of climate change, then I would encourage Highman Benefice to join with the 40 or so other churches in Gloucester Diocese by registering with a Rocha, that's a Christian charity, and starting to work towards an Eco-Church award. Now, I don't think you've got one at the moment, but it's quite doable. And I expect within a few months you would find that you could make good progress at fairly low cost. And the 5 areas that the Eco-Church Award covers are worship and teaching, stewardship of our buildings, caring for the land, such as the churchyard, community and global aspects, and then, this is where it gets really tricky, personal lifestyle. And if you'd like to know more about that scheme and the sort of questions or statements that need to be examined, then I've left a few copies of the document at the back for you to examine on your way out. But I think it's fair to say that it's only by putting our own house in order that the Church of England will have credibility to challenge the politicians and business leaders. So finally, I'd like to thank Canon Helen again for the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and may God bless you in all that you're doing to become better stewards of God's amazing creation. Amen.